Welcome to Beyond the Music, the podcast where we dive into the lives and stories of people who shaped the world of music. I am Karina.
And I'm Lena. We're both classically trained singers, and this podcast is our chance to explore the fascinating intersections of music, history, and humanity.
In our previous episode, we discussed Beethoven's hearing, and today we will be exploring the history of women on and off the stage.
So, let's start with something that might sound shocking today. There was a time when women were simply not allowed to perform on stage at all.
Oh!
And we're not just talking about opera, we're talking about theater in general.
Exactly. If we go back to the time of William Shakespeare in the late 16th and early 17th century, women were banned from acting in England. That means all the female roles, like Juliet, Ophelia, Lady Macbeth, were performed by boys or young men.
Which is honestly wild to imagine today, especially when you think about how emotionally complex those characters are. But at the time, it was considered inappropriate for women to appear in public performance spaces. It was seen as morally questionable, even dangerous for their reputation.
And this wasn't just in England. Across Europe, there was a strong association between women performing publicly and ideas of immorality. So women did make music, but mostly in private settings.
Exactly. Women were very active musically, just not on public stages. They performed in salons, courts, and private gatherings. These were controlled environments where their presence was considered more appropriate.
And in these spaces, women were often highly skilled musicians. They played instruments, sang, composed, but their work was rarely published or publicly recognized. It was almost like they were allowed to have talent, but not to own it publicly.
And this creates a really interesting contrast. On one hand, women were essential to musical life. On the other hand, they were systematically excluded from visibility and recognition.
Now, let's get into one of the most fascinating and honestly strange aspects of this history. Why were some instruments considered appropriate for women and others completely forbidden?
Yes, because this wasn't random at all. It was deeply connected to social expectations about femininity, the body, and behavior. For example, instruments like the harpsichord, piano, or harp were considered suitable for women.
And the reason? They allowed for a graceful posture. You could sit upright, composed, elegant, everything that matched the ideal image of a proper lady.
But instruments like the cello or wind instruments were often considered inappropriate. And this is where it gets a bit ridiculous, honestly.
Because playing the cello requires you to sit with your legs apart, which was considered indecent. The wind instruments, they involve facial movement, breath, sometimes even puffing the cheeks, which was seen as unattractive or improper.
Which is fun because harp you also put between your legs, so it's really
Exactly.
inconsistent. Yeah,
it just doesn't make sense.
yeah. So basically, it wasn't about musical ability at all. It was about how the body looked while playing.
Exactly. Music was filtered through social expectations of femininity. It wasn't just, can you play? It was, in fact, do you still look like a respectable woman while playing?
So when did this start to change? Well, one of the earliest turning points was in Italy in the 17th century, where women began appearing on opera stages.
Yes! Opera actually became one of the first spaces where women were allowed to perform publicly. And interestingly, this created a contrast with church music, where women were still banned from singing.
Which is why, for a long time, high vocal parts in church were sung by castrati, and we did an episode on that. you can listen back if you want to know more about that. But for those who don't want it, here a small explanation. Castrati are men who had been castrated before puberty to preserve their high voices.
Yes, Lena, your episode on castrati was fantastic, even though it made me cringe a little bit. And that just shows just how far society was willing to go to avoid women performing publicly, even when it meant extreme measures.
Yeah, it's so strange because so the patriarchy wanted to avoid to put women in a place like that. So they hurt other men.
Mm-hmm.
It's so strange. Well, by the 18th and 19th century, things began to shift more noticeably.
Woo!
Women started to become stars.
Yay!
Especially in opera.
Yes, singers like Maria Malibran became international celebrities. They had fame, influence, and public recognition, something that would have been impossible just a century earlier.
But here's the contradiction. Even though women were now visible and celebrated, they were still heavily judged, especially in terms of morality, appearance, and behavior.
So they gained visibility, but not full freedom. They were admired, but also scrutinized.
Another important point is composition. Women were composing music throughout history, but their works were often overlooked or published under male names.
A great example is Fandy. A great example is Fanny Mendelssohn, whose
It's
works
Fanny Mendelssohn. It's not Fanny.
Funny.
Mm-hmm.
See, over here we say Fanny.
No, it's Fanny Hensel. It's her married name then.
Ah. A great example is Fanny Mendelssohn, whose works were sometimes published under her brother's name, Felix Mendelssohn.
And that shows how recognition wasn't just about talent. It was about access and permission.
So why is this a connections within music topic? Because this history connects social structures, gender roles, and musical development.
And it also explains why certain traditions still exist today, like stereotypes about voice types, repertoire, or even stage presence.
It reminds us that music history isn't just about composers and pieces. It's about people, power, and who was allowed to be seen and heard.
So, let's end with a few fun and slightly absurd facts.
Yay!
Women were once discouraged from playing the flute because it was considered too sensual.
And the harp became popular partly because it looked elegant on stage. It was almost like a visual accessory as much as an instrument.
And maybe that's also the reason why there are more female harpists than male.
Maybe. Or maybe it has to do with, in that time, harps were considered to be similar to angelic sounds.
Yeah, also. But it's really interesting. In the universities, I never met a harpist. I always, like a male harpist, I just met female harpists. It's always the small and really tiny females who have this huge instrument to carry around who are playing the harp.
Okay, male harpists, give us a comment. Reach out to us. We'd love to meet you.
Why did you decide on the harp? And why are there so many females? It's like the really opposite of every other instrument. And then some early female performers had to rely on male relatives to approve their careers publicly. Nice one.
Looking back, it's incredible how much has changed, and also how recent some of these changes are.
And it makes you appreciate the stage we stand on today, because it wasn't always accessible.
I hope you enjoyed the history of women on and off the stage as much as we did. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review.
Next time, we'll delve into another fascinating chapter of music history. Until then, keep listening and discovering the stories beyond the music.
See you next time.